congratulations, you survived again. Uncle Russ Gibb jumping up and down right here in good old Group W Cable in Dearborn, Michigan. And I got an interesting fella for you today to talk to, Dr. Tom McLennan. Some people think he is going to be the next superintendent of schools. I happen to think he should be the next superintendent of schools. Gentleman that's been with our system for as long as I can remember. In fact, I think he's born and bred right here in good old Dearborn, Michigan. But we're going to be talking to Tom a little bit about some of the reports that have been coming out recently from the Presidential Study or Commission on the quality and the state of education in America today. So we're going to be talking to Tom just about his views on education and a little bit about what he thinks all the negative press is doing to education. And is it legit? It should be a fun conversation because I'm a teacher, Tom's a teacher, and maybe out of the two of us we can come up with some insights, hopefully on education. Speaking of education, I'd like to educate the Detroit News. Doggone newspapers get me so angry. I just jump up and down when I see them. This happens to be out of April 30th edition of the Detroit News. And it talks about scientist rejects Dow dioxin claim. And if you read it, it says, Dr. Samuel S. Epstein, a professor of environmental such and such, says the Dow is playing word games, so forth and so on. And he goes on to say that the study that Dow Chemical put out was a bunch of poppycock. Well, that's fine. You know, he's entitled to his opinion. He's a professional person, a man that obviously has some expertise. And, you know, good men can disagree. I have no problems with that. But what did catch my eye in the story is as you read on further down, it says that Dr. Epstein was in Detroit yesterday to deliver the keynote address to the second annual awards dinner of the Southeast Michigan Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health. Now, all of a sudden, that word coalition jumped into this story, and that's what was the tip-off, because it seems the good doctor's written a book about cancer and toxins in our environment, and of course, anytime a guy writes a book, he has a vested interest into creating a little publicity. Plus the word coalition. Now, just who is the Southeast Michigan Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health? Nowhere in the story that the Detroit News put out did they say who this coalition, who are the people involved in this coalition. I have a suspicion you'll find out it's a UAW-CIO. And I have no problem with them having a coalition, except I think they ought to spell out who's paying the bills, because too often we find a group of 2 or 3 people getting together, calling themselves a coalition, and immediately the news media picks up as though this is a movement. And I object to that. I object strenuously to that type of technique. If the newspaper puts in the Southeast Michigan Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health, then I want to know who did it. Who are they? Do you know anybody that would join an organization like that? I mean, you're a busy person. You got a lot of things to do. Would you join a coalition like that? Are you involved? It's hard enough to get people involved in their schools, never mind something called the Southeast Michigan Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health. Plus, I find it interesting that right at the height of the dioxin scare, do they have their second annual banquet? I find that very interesting. What about you? Maybe that's a little bit of news manipulation. Unfortunately, our newspapers, our media, our radio and our television too often jump to the negative and forget about the positive. I had a lady the other day say, "Oh, Mr. Gibb, I like your show, but every once in a while it's so boring. Why don't you have exciting people?" And I say, wait a minute, never mind exciting people. I think I have a responsibility to have all people. And what's exciting to you, madam, might not be exciting to someone else. Last week I did a show with a young high school person that visited Germany. Quite frankly, maybe that's not a wide interest group, but I don't think that that's necessary. I think I have an obligation in the media to present all kinds of stories. And I would invite you, if you have an idea for a story or you'd like to appear as a guest on the Russ Gibb at Random show, please just drop me a card here at Russ Gibb at Random, Mercantile Drive, Dearborn, Michigan, and you too can be on the show. It's that easy. That's what it's all about. That's what I believe is my responsibility. I think President Reagan was absolutely right when he lectured the media the other day about the word responsibility. Too often we hear the word freedom of the press and not enough about responsibility of the press. And when I say press, I mean radio, television, and people like myself, okay? Listen, enough of this ranting and raving. Let's pay some bills, and then on with my guest, Mr. Tom McLennan, Associate Superintendent of Schools at Dearborn, Michigan. We'll be talking about education. Hello again. My guest, Dr. Tom McLennan. Do you want me to call you Doctor or Tom?
Tom.
Tom. I notice you do that with a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I would imagine a man that works as hard to get a doctorate would like to use that title. I'd love it if I were a PhD. I'd say, call me Dr. Gibb.
I think titles are sometimes they get in the way of objectivity and establishing good communication with other people, so we try to avoid it.
You know, I've noticed, though, that some of the people that I admire most just go like yourself, Tom, and they don't throw in the doctor all the time. And you find out later that they have their PhD, but they just don't, you know, they don't like to wave it around. And somehow I think that's a good thing. I like that. I like that, Tom.
Good.
Tom, I invited you down today because I picked up the paper last week and I read some indictments on education. And I know you're a man that spent your life devoted to education as a teacher and as an administrator. And I wonder what you feel about some of the reports that are coming out on this presidential commission.
Well, Russ, I think the report should not be taken lightly. I've just read the report, and I haven't had a full period of time to digest it and to think about it. I received it, a copy yesterday. You're talking about the report of the National Commission on Excellence in Education.
Right.
That was an 18-member committee that was established in 1981 by Secretary Bell and was chaired by the president of, I believe, the University of Utah,
right.
David Gardner. And in fact, 2 Michigan residents participated on the committee, on the 18-member committee. Dr. Emerald Crosby, who's a high school principal in Detroit, and a lady from outstate.
Do you think it was a wide, did they have a wide variety? Did they have big city school people represented and representatives from school systems like Dearborn?
I think it was a good variety, a cross-country grouping of people. I think the university community was involved, the public schools were involved, the non-public schools had representation as well.
Oh, I see. I didn't realize that.
Yes, there's a principal of, I believe, a Lutheran high school who participated. And I believe it was a representative committee, or at least a good effort at such.
Tom, what was your biggest impression as you read what things stood out right away after you finished? What did you come away with? What was the feeling?
Well, the feeling was that the committee has said what many have believed for some period of time, and that is that in many parts of our country we have an educational crisis. In fact, one committee statement was that we have been in effect committing an act of unthinking, unilateral educational disarmament.
Now, what does that mean? That's a teacher talking. That's a college professor talking.
Right. What they're saying, I think, is that in comparison to what's going on in the rest of the world, as the balance of the world is tooling up educationally, we're tooling down. We're not doing the things that we should be doing to maintain a pace with the other industrial countries of the world.
Why is that, in your opinion, Tom?
Well, I think part of it's because we haven't committed the resources, the national resources, to education, either at the local, state, or federal level, that this report feels should be committed.
Tom, I read a report, and of course reports and reports. I'm sure you know that you can pick up a survey to show anything you want, but I read a report that from 1970 to 1980, that maybe the cost of living had risen 105%, whereas the amount of money devoted to education had risen by 400 and some percent. And yet the quality of education seems to be going down. Now, that would say no, that we have been putting our resources in education, and yet we're not getting the bang for our buck. Do you believe that, or is that, what do I believe? What should I believe?
Well, I think, first of all, you should consider that particularly in states such as Michigan, where we've been very hard-pressed economically, that necessarily monies have been reduced to education because receipts of state government are down.
Okay.
And as that occurs, we find that any state assistance has been drastically curtailed. Now, I think that indicates that when that assistance is curtailed, that programs are going to be necessarily curtailed as well. I think that the cost of living impact over the 70s has been substantial. I think we've seen with that a reassertion of standards in an effort to get teacher salaries and school salaries generally into a par level with the balance of the economy. And as a result of these things and the fact that we have had periods of economic highs and economic lows, we have a condition where more money is spent, and yet at the same time as it's spent, we have now entered into a period of economic decline. The money's had to be withdrawn, and the only thing you can do when that occurs is lay off staff, because that's 80% of the financial expenditure of a school. You lay off staff, you curtail program, and you get into the kind of circumstance that's complained about here.
What was their big complaint as far as staff was concerned? Too old?
No, I think interestingly, they felt that two or three things. One is that staff and parents and communities haven't set high enough expectation levels for students, and that is something that must be corrected.
In other words, we want the kids to shoot higher, so we say, hey, we put the hurdles up.
Well, we want them to shoot higher, but we want them to have additional experiences at the high school level. We should demand more of them at the high school level. We should demand more in terms of grades. We should demand more in terms of requirements to get out of high school and to get into the university or college or whatever.
Well, no, I have some problems with that one, because it seems to me that here in Dearborn, don't we have a higher requirement to graduate than, say, in Detroit?
Oh, yes, I think we do.
Credit-wise?
Credit-wise, we have one of the highest requirements in the state. We require 23
Credit hours to graduate.
Yes, 23 credit hours from our high school. And I think the public has to know that a unit of credit is basically taking 1 hour of instruction for a period of 1 year.
Okay.
So that in the course of a year, a student would go to school 6 hours a day in Dearborn, and for that entire year receive 6 credits, 6 units of credit.
Now in Detroit, it seems to me that the figure 18 sticks in my mind.
That could be true. I'm not
You're not
certain.
aware of that. I know it's a lower figure than
It's
in
lower
Dearborn.
in most school districts.
Okay, so that report that we've been reading about doesn't necessarily apply to Dearborn.
It doesn't necessarily apply to us, although I think that in some ways it should apply to us. I think what it's saying is that if we have 23 units of credit in our high school program, we should reinforce those, we should keep them, we should re-examine what we expect of students in the areas of English, social studies, math, science, and so on. For example, I believe one expectation, 4 units of English. That means 4 years of English, 1 hour per day, both semesters, and we do expect that. It would expect.
Is that expected now of a student
That's
in Dearborn?
expected right now of a student in our high school program for graduation.
But what about science and math? Do we require that? Can a kid get out of Fortson High without taking math and science?
Well,
And is that good if he does?
our requirement for math is certainly not what the high school report or this report's findings say they should be. We require 4 years of English, as I said, which matches their requirement.
So we're doing a job.
We're doing a job in English. We require a year and a half of mathematics. That is required.
Okay.
to
What are
graduate.
they asking?
And they
in
ask
the
for
report?
3 years.
So we're not doing it there.
We're
We
not.
should beef up our math.
Well, we're not requiring that to get out of high school in Dearborn. They say we should require 3 years of science, and we require 2. years of science. And so we're not requiring what this report says we should require. They say we should require 3 years of social studies, and we are requiring 3 years of social studies. So to that extent, we're meeting that standard.
Okay.
And they also say, interestingly, that we should require 1/2 year of computer science. And
Are we doing any of that now?
And we have a very significant computer science program, but we do not require every student in our high school to take a semester of computer science in order to be able to graduate from high school.
Okay, if we were to implement some of those suggestions, what would it cost, do you think? Or do we have the staff on hand that could handle that, do you think?
Well,
In Dearborn?
I think it would depend. These suggestions would require additional staffing. Obviously, at the high school level, if you double the mathematics requirement, you are going to require additional staff.
Additional math teachers.
Additional math teachers. If you, for example, increase from 2 to 3 years the science requirement, you're going to require 50% more time with students, and you have to have staff to provide that time.
How do you feel about that? Can you speak on that? I know that you're up for contention in the superintendent's job, and that might be a constraint on some things that you might say right at this point. I understand that. I'm on record that I think you'd be a good superintendent. I would hope that you'd get the job. I hope that our school board recognizes that. I know you can't comment on that, okay? I understand that fully. But what is your feeling about that, just off the record, as to should we go ahead and beef up our science?
Well, Russ, as I said before, I've just read the report, and I'm not certain I agree with all phases of the report. For example, I brought along somewhere in this stack a sheet that depicts the various strands of high school mathematics. That's Dearborn High, for example.
Okay.
And you can see that a student on a high strand is able to take 6 or 8 semesters of high school math.
There are a lot of, there's algebra, there's basic math, there's trig, advanced math, calculus 1 and 2, consumer math, refresher math.
Emphasizing that the calculus would be taken either at Henry Ford or at U of M Dearborn. So I would think that to say that every student in a school had to have 3 years of math would depend in part on what it is that student
desires to go into.
Views as a requirement.
But you know, I was forced to take math at Fortson High. That I remember Mr. McCarberry, God bless him, my algebra teacher, put up with my, I was in a daze half the time. And yet, as I look back on it now, I realized that he was really teaching me some thinking processes. That the math was sort of incidental.
Absolutely.
That it was a way of thinking. It was a discipline. And I, quite frankly, I think that math is a very important thing. I would hope that we would stress the hell out of it in our schools. I think that English, and I'm not talking about reading or writing or mass media 1. I think that kids ought to have some basic how to write a sentence, some grammar, some spelling courses. Oftentimes we dilute, it seems to me, our good intentions by trying to make it easy. And did that come out in that report?
Well, I think what the report said in part was we aren't expecting enough, we don't have enough time on task, we don't have enough time in school, so we should have a longer school day.
What do you think about that?
I think our school day of 6 hours for a high school student is one of the highest requirements in the state.
Okay.
And I think it's very adequate. I don't believe it's necessary to go to a 7-hour day in order to be able to achieve the kinds of things that this report wants us to achieve.
Right.
But I believe there are many districts in the country that probably have 4-hour or 5-hour days, and they're trying to gird that up. I think 180 school day year is sufficient. I think if we work diligently within that 6-hour, 180 school day year, then we can do some of the kinds of things that or all of the kinds of things.
Okay, you're saying that the
wants.
quality of education is an important consideration as well as the quantity of education.
Absolutely. And the report stresses a 200 or a 220-day year, and I'm not certain, first of all, at this point, that that can improve to the extent they feel education should be improved, can improve the program across the country. I mentioned that a student, the math requirement would in some way be dictated by the student's interest. I think, too, requirements are dictated by what that student and parent and counselor or teacher feel the requirements are out in the community, out in the real world of getting a job. And until the last 5 years, certainly the technical aspect, the importance of math, computer science, and so on have certainly not come to the fore the way they have in the last 5 years. At one time, if we went back 30 years, we had a very high school dropout rate.
That's right.
And today, we are containing and keeping more students in high school. We're trying to provide a general education to students and a high-quality education to a cross-section of students, hoping that those students who are talented and gifted in particular areas will follow strands, such as we mentioned there, and pursue excellence in those fields.
Doctor, we're at that time. Obviously, we're going to have to do a lot of talking about this report. More than 20 minutes, because really when you get into education, there's so many facets. It's so easy on the surface to take cracks at us, and yet when you really get into it and you hear different points of view, you become aware and you say, hey, this is a very complex thing that we're trying to do, educate our young. We can all do it better, and I know we're going to all try to do it better, too. Dr. McLennan, I want to thank you for being my guest today. You have this microphone anytime you want it. The next time you come, I hope you're the superintendent. How about that? Russ Gibb, I'll be back right after these announcements. Back again, Dr. Tom McLennan. Interesting man. You make the difference, Group W Cable. Who pinned that on my desk? Life in the big city. Hey, for those of you that took time to view the show, I'd like to say thank you. For those of you that took time to drop me a card or a letter, I'd like to say thank you. But most of all, I'd like to thank you for just being you. Russ Gibb, at random.